Ask a historian 2 centuries ago exactly when the Roman Empire ended, and they would not hesitate for a single second. They would offer a specific, incredibly confident answer. They would not speak of a gradual fading out nor a complicated transition. For them, there was a hard, definitive deadline for the greatest empire the world had ever seen. 476 CE. In that year, a Germanic leader named Odo Acer deposed the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus. And just like that, according to the traditional historical view, the centuries-old Western Roman Empire was officially wiped off the map. It paints a stark picture of a sudden, catastrophic end to an era. For generations, this was known as the collapse school of thought. They viewed the fall of Rome as a sudden, violent apocalypse. To them, Rome was a massive military superpower that crushed itself under the weight of its own immoderate greatness. It simply grew too large too fast. It stretched its borders, its economy, and its resources so incredibly thin that the entire system finally snapped. But did the Roman Empire actually fall, or did it just change its clothes? Interrogating history's greatest debate reveals much more than the fate of an ancient civilization. When we look at modern superpowers or our own cultures, understanding how Rome actually transitioned tells us a great deal about what resilience and collapse truly look like. To comprehend this collapse theory, we must look to the architect of this worldview, British historian Edward Gibbon. He published his massive, defining work, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, in 1776. This epic narrative shaped how the entire Western world viewed Rome for the next 2 centuries. Looking back from the 18th century, Gibbon viewed the empire through a lens of profound moral and civic decay. He pointed to what he saw as the definitive hallmarks of a dying culture, a societal obsession with sex, bizarre and freakish art that abandoned classical beauty, and a massive, crushing wealth gap between the ultra-rich elite and the desperate, starving poor. To Gibbon, Rome was a patient, slowly bleeding out from 1,000 self-inflicted cuts. By the time the so-called barbarians finally arrived at the gates, they were not felling a healthy, vibrant giant. They were merely delivering the inevitable final blow to a rotting, terminally ill system. This collapse theory became the unassailable foundation of history for generations of scholars. It offered a clean, binary worldview. Rome existed, and then suddenly, it did not. We love clear start and end dates. We love dramatic stories of rise and ruin because they offer a perfectly neat package for a very messy reality. This dramatic, catastrophic narrative was incredibly popular because it allowed modern European nations to claim their own epic origin stories right in the wreckage. If Rome completely fell and plunged the world into the Dark Ages, then legends like King Arthur in Britain or Clovis in France could emerge from the ashes to build entirely new nations. The fall of Rome became the dramatic prequel to the glorious rise of modern Europe. But fast forward to the 1970s, and a massive paradigm shift in history occurred, introducing a new school of thought that argued Rome did not collapse into a dark age, but rather evolved and transformed over centuries.
In 1970, historian Peter Brown dropped what you might call a scholarly bombshell.
His central thesis was quite radical at the time. The Roman Empire, he argued, hadn't actually fallen at all. Instead, it had merely undergone a series of really dramatic alterations.
Brown argued that we should really stop looking at the year 476 CE as this catastrophic downfall, and instead, we should see it as a dissolution. This new period, which he dubbed Late Antiquity, stretched all the way out to 750 CE, and that is long after the last emperor supposedly abdicated.
So, what does this actually look like? Well, proponents of this dissolution theory argue that Roman elite culture didn't just vanish into thin air, it simply migrated.
Take the classic Roman tradition of public generosity and civic leadership, for instance.
Instead of funding pagan temples, or say, throwing massive gladiatorial games, the elite shifted their focus. They began funding churches and offering alms for the poor. When you look closely at figures like Augustine of Hippo or Ambrose of Milan, they were essentially Roman noblemen. They were just using the church to maintain their regional power.
In this view, the barbarians weren't mindlessly destroying things. Think of them more like new management, coming in and taking over an already existing corporate structure.
And if you want to see this in practice, just look at the material evidence championed by this school of thought.
Objects like the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus are a perfect example.
What we're seeing here are traditional Roman sculpting styles being actively used to tell Christian stories.
For Peter Brown, this is a glaringly clear indication that the traditional Roman way of doing things didn't actually change all that much, simply because a Northern European happened to take power.
Because ultimately, life for the common person, they claimed, stayed remarkably stable.
But not everyone was convinced by this seamless transition narrative. For decades, you see, the prevailing academic wind kind of suggested that Rome didn't actually fall, it simply evolved. But as we transition into Act 3 here, we're confronting a much darker, honestly much dirtier reality. And it's one that's been hidden right beneath the soil.
Right around the early 2000s, this neo-collapse school emerged, led by historians like Brian Ward Perkins. And they completely challenged that comfortable, sanitized view of late antiquity. They argued that this romanticized idea of a peaceful cultural shift was, well, really just a modern fiction, one that completely ignored the profound suffering of millions of people.
Now, Ward Perkins, who was actually the son of an archaeologist, looked past all that elite poetry and decided to focus on the trash. He realized that those aristocrats writing elegant little letters to one another from their fortified villas didn't really represent the reality of the empire. So to find the truth, he didn't look in the libraries. Instead, he looked in the middens, the ash layers, and the garbage pits of the everyday common people.
By really examining those material remains, we're talking the pottery, the housing, and, incredibly, even the size of the cattle, he argued that for the average person there was a very real and very painful end of civilization. Think about this. Cows that had been specifically bred to massive sizes under Roman agricultural systems suddenly shrank right back to Iron Age proportions. And those sturdy stone and mortar homes, they literally dissolved back into mud and timber.
The archaeological record is, well, it's brutal. It tells a story not of some gentle evolution, but of sudden violence, of starvation, and a catastrophic loss of complex systems.
So, while the elite might have been sitting around debating philosophy in their shiny new church rolls, the common person's world was drastically shrinking. That vast, interconnected Roman Mediterranean, a place where a peasant in Gaul might eat from a bowl fired all the way in North Africa, that just vanished. People's horizons contracted to the very edges of their own impoverished villages. And specialized industries like professional pottery or making high-quality roofing tiles disappeared almost overnight in a lot of regions. The actual knowledge required to use a potter's wheel or to fire a waterproof clay tile was simply lost. Communities were forced to completely return to crude hand-shaped pots and easily flammable thatched roofs.
Just look at Britannia, for example. The standard of living there dropped so sharply that it took nearly 1,000 years just to return to Roman levels. The island went from this centralized province, complete with underfloor heating, bustling markets, and imported luxuries, to a completely fractured landscape of basic subsistence farming. It really wasn't until the High Middle Ages that the British economy finally recovered the sheer complexity it lost back in the 5th century.
To Ward Perkins, calling this a transformation is like calling a car crash a sudden change in travel velocity.
For centuries, humanity has been captivated by the concept of the fall of Rome. We picture barbarians at the gates, burning cities, and the absolute end of civilization. But what if it never truly fell at all? What if everything we have been taught about the end of antiquity is only half the story? We must confront a deeply compelling question. How do we reconcile the undeniable physical ruins of the Roman Empire with the equally undeniable survival of its ideas? We walk through Rome today, seeing shattered columns and crumbling arenas, yet we live in a modern society fundamentally built upon those very Roman foundations. This brings us to the heart of a profound historical divide: collapse versus survival. For generations, history was neatly divided into two rigid camps. The collapse camp argues that the 5th century brought a violent, catastrophic breakdown of trade, security, and traditional Roman political systems. The world grew darker and more dangerous. Meanwhile, the survival camp counters that everyday life for many continued uninterrupted. Core Roman values, laws, and cultures simply adapted to new Germanic rulers. Absolute devastation on one side, quiet endurance on the other. It is a monumental, historical tension. The sudden, violent collapse of an empire versus the gradual, quiet survival of a culture. Who is right? Modern historians, such as Peter Heather, are increasingly pushing for a synthesis, bridging this vast gap. It is not a simple binary scenario. The political entity, the vast state that collected taxes to fund a massive standing army, undeniably collapsed in the West. But that catastrophic political failure forced the surviving cultural and social elites to adapt, embedding their sophisticated Roman ideals directly into the Germanic kingdoms that replaced the empire. This reveals a crucial mechanism: dissolution and evolution. This is not simply about an empire vanishing overnight. It is about the mechanics of how a superpower transforms when its central engine completely breaks down.
Traditional Roman systems inherently collapsed. The emperors, the sweeping legions, the imperial taxation networks, they were gone. But Roman values survived, finding a powerful new vessel, the Church. The Church effectively preserved Roman administrative boundaries, Roman law, and the Latin language. Local bishops stepped into the vast power vacuum left by fleeing Roman governors. The massive change was fueled by systemic collapse, but the ultimate recovery was driven by profound cultural adaptation.
The crucial point is this: the Roman Empire didn't simply fall, nor did it peacefully change hands. It dissolved and evolved. It broke apart into its constituent pieces, but those fragmented pieces retained their core Roman DNA, leaving behind a profound blueprint for the modern world. Consider this modern blueprint. Our contemporary legal codes across the West are heavily based on Justinian's compilation of Roman law. Our governmental structures, our senates, our modern republics, even the architectural styles of our government buildings are intentional echoes of Rome. We are still living inside the cultural architecture that survived that ancient dissolution. The historical debate continues. History is not a stagnant record of the distant past. It is about how we choose to see it, and how that lens shapes the understanding of our own civilization. When we look back at Rome, we are looking in a mirror, asking ourselves what truly makes a society resilient. We must remain curious, as these historical narratives are constantly being re-evaluated. Diving deeper into the hidden achievements and massive philosophical shifts of the past reveals that human progress is not a straight line. It is a complex, messy, and fascinating process of systemic breakdown and unexpected renewal. Subscribe to Vantage to continue exploring these profound shifts. Understanding these secrets of the ancient world grants us a haunting perspective on our present moment. It leaves us with a provocative thought. When we look at our own rapidly changing global institutions today, are we witnessing a collapse? Or are we merely watching the very beginning of our own dissolution and evolution? Join us next time to unlock more secrets of the ancient world.